In the heart of East Africa, in the country of Uganda, a man was rising. Not with loud speeches. Not with promises. But with silence, and power. His name was Idi Amin. At first, he was just a soldier. Strong. Tall. Fearless. People saw him as a simple man, someone who followed orders, someone who stayed quiet, someone who didn't ask questions. But sometimes, the quietest men are the most dangerous. The early life. Idi Amin was born in a poor family. He had little education, but he had something else, physical strength and a powerful presence. He joined the army at a young age. And that's where everything changed. Because in the army, he didn't just follow orders. He learned how power works. The man who learned fast. Amin quickly became known among his officers. Not for intelligence. But for loyalty. And for something darker. He never hesitated. If he was told to act, he acted. If he was told to be ruthless, he showed no mercy. Slowly, he started gaining trust. And in a system built on fear, that trust was everything. There were rumors. Whispers among soldiers. Stories that no one wanted to confirm. People said Amin was different. They said he enjoyed control. They said he didn't just follow orders. He enjoyed them. But no one spoke openly. Because in places where power grows, fear grows faster. The turning point. By the late 1960s, Amin had become one of the most powerful men in the Ugandan army. But he wanted more. He didn't want to serve power. He wanted to become power. And then came the moment that changed everything. The night of the coup. In 1971, while the president of Uganda was away, Idi Amin made his move. The army surrounded key locations. Radio stations were taken over. And within hours, the government was gone. Amin came on the radio and spoke to the nation. His voice was calm. Controlled. From today, he said, I am in charge. No elections. No debate. No resistance. Just power. The beginning of fear. At first, people celebrated. They thought Amin would bring change. They thought he would fix the country. They thought he would be different. But they were wrong. Very wrong. Because what came next was not leadership. It was fear. When Idi Amin took control of Uganda in 1971, many people believed a new era had begun. They saw him as a strong leader. A man who would bring stability. A man who would protect the country. But within months, everything changed. The disappearances begin. At first, it was small. One man didn't return home. Then another. Then another. Families went to the police. But the police had no answers. Or worse. They stayed silent. Because everyone knew something terrifying. The people who disappeared were not random. They were chosen. The soldiers in the night. Late at night, trucks would move quietly through the streets. No sirens. No noise. Just shadows. Men in uniform would knock on doors. Just like a normal visit. But once the door opened, the person inside would never be seen again. No arrest records. No charges. No explanation. Only silence. Soon, fear spread across Uganda. People stopped talking freely. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. Friends became careful. Even families whispered inside their own homes. Because anyone could be listening. The secret police. Amin created special units. Groups of men who followed his orders without question. They didn't wear official uniforms. They didn't follow laws. They followed one thing only. Fear. These men became known as the ones who made people disappear. And no one could stop them. The leader who smiled. The strangest part was this. While all of this was happening, Idi Amin was smiling in public. He gave speeches. He laughed with crowds. He called himself a man of the people. But behind that smile, something darker was growing. The list. One day, a former officer revealed something shocking. There was a list. A list of names. People who were marked as dangerous. People who would be removed. One by one. No trial. No warning. Just disappearance. No one was safe. Doctors. Teachers. Soldiers. Even government officials. No one was safe anymore. Because in Amin's rule, loyalty was not enough. Fear was the only protection. The truth no one spoke. People started asking one question quietly. Where are all these people going? But no one dared to say the answer out loud. Because deep inside, everyone already knew. By now, fear had taken control of every corner of Uganda. People were no longer asking questions. Because asking questions could get you killed. The places no one returned from. There were rumors. Dark rumors. About places where people were taken. Old buildings. Military barracks. Hidden rooms. Places where screams were heard at night, but never in the morning. People said once you were taken there, you never came back. The river that told the truth. Soon, something even more horrifying began to happen. Bodies started appearing in the rivers. Floating silently. Unidentified. Unclaimed. The water carried a message no one wanted to hear. The missing people were not missing anymore. The system of fear. This was no longer random violence. This was a system. A machine. A system where people were taken, questioned, and eliminated. And the most terrifying part. It was organized. Planned. Controlled. The men who followed orders. Idi Amin had surrounded himself with men who did not question him. Men who believed that power meant control. Men who believed that fear was necessary. They didn't think of themselves as criminals. They thought they were protecting the country. But in reality, they were destroying it. Entire neighborhoods became quiet. Too quiet. Doors stayed closed. Lights turned off early. People stopped visiting each other. Even laughter disappeared. Because in a country ruled by fear, silence becomes survival. The world starts to notice. Slowly, the outside world began to hear about what was happening in Uganda. Journalists started asking questions. Other countries began to worry. Stories of violence, disappearances, and death spread beyond borders. But inside Uganda, nothing changed. Because inside Uganda, fear was still in control. The man who could not be stopped. Many people wondered. Why doesn't anyone stop him? Why doesn't the army turn against him? Why doesn't someone speak up? But the truth was simple. Everyone was afraid. Because anyone who tried to stand against Idi Amin became part of the same story. A story of disappearance. The darkness grows. By the mid-1970s, thousands of people were gone. Families were broken. Lives were destroyed. And still, the leader stood strong. Smiling. Speaking. Pretending everything was normal. Entire neighborhoods became quiet. Too quiet. Doors stayed closed. Lights turned off early. People stopped visiting each other. Even laughter disappeared. Because in a country ruled by fear, silence becomes survival. The world starts to notice. Slowly, the outside world began to hear about what was happening in Uganda. Journalists started asking questions. Other countries began to worry. Stories of violence, disappearances, and death spread beyond borders. But inside Uganda, nothing changed. Because inside Uganda, fear was still in control. The man who could not be stopped. Many people wondered. Why doesn't anyone stop him? Why doesn't the army turn against him? Why doesn't someone speak up? But the truth was simple. Everyone was afraid. Because anyone who tried to stand against Idi Amin became part of the same story. A story of disappearance. The darkness grows. By the mid-1970s, thousands of people were gone. Families were broken. Lives were destroyed. And still, the leader stood strong. Smiling. Speaking. Pretending everything was normal. Entire neighborhoods became quiet. Too quiet. Doors stayed closed. Lights turned off early. People stopped visiting each other. Even laughter disappeared. Because in a country ruled by fear, silence becomes survival. The world starts to notice. Slowly, the outside world began to hear about what was happening in Uganda. Journalists started asking questions. Other countries began to worry. Stories of violence, disappearances, and death spread beyond borders. But inside Uganda, nothing changed. Because inside Uganda, fear was still in control. The man who could not be stopped. Many people wondered. Why doesn't anyone stop him? Why doesn't the army turn against him? Why doesn't someone speak up? But the truth was simple. Everyone was afraid. Because anyone who tried to stand against Idi Amin became part of the same story. A story of disappearance. The darkness grows. By the mid-1970s, thousands of people were gone. Families were broken. Lives were destroyed. And still, the leader stood strong. Smiling. Speaking. Pretending everything was normal.
By the late 1970s, something had changed in Uganda. The fear was still there. But now, it was mixed with anger. The people were tired. For years, people had stayed silent. They had watched their loved ones disappear. They had lived in fear. But silence cannot last forever. Slowly, people began to lose that fear. And when fear disappears, resistance begins. The army was divided. Inside the army, the situation was getting worse. Some soldiers were still loyal to Idi Amin. But others were not. They had seen too much. They had lost friends. They had lost trust. And now, they were starting to turn against him. A dangerous decision. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1978, Idi Amin made a decision that shocked the world. He ordered his army to cross the border and attack Tanzania. At first, it looked like a show of power. But in reality, it was a mistake. A big mistake. The war begins. Tanzania did not stay silent. They fought back. And this time, Amin was not fighting his own people. He was facing a real army. A strong army. And the war was not easy.
As the war continued, things started falling apart. Supplies became weak. Soldiers lost confidence. Orders were not followed. The same army that once feared him was no longer listening. The escape of fear. Back in Uganda, people heard the news. For the first time in years, they felt something different. Hope. Because if Amin could be challenged from outside, maybe he could be defeated from inside. The leader alone. Idi Amin was no longer the same powerful man. He was still speaking. Still smiling. Still pretending everything was under control. But behind that image, he was losing everything. Power. Trust. Control. The end was near. The war was getting closer. The enemy was getting stronger. And Amin's rule was getting weaker. The man who once controlled everything with fear was now facing something he could not control. The fall. By early 1979, everything was falling apart in Uganda. The man who once controlled the nation with fear was now losing control of everything around him. The war reaches the capital. The war with Tanzania had grown stronger. But this was no longer just a border conflict. This was an invasion. Tanzanian forces, along with Ugandan exiles, were moving closer, step by step, toward the capital city. Every day, the distance between Amin's power and his enemies was getting smaller. The collapse of the army. Inside the Ugandan army, chaos had taken over. Soldiers were confused. Some were running away. Some were refusing to fight. Some were secretly switching sides. The same army that once followed Idi Amin without question, was now breaking apart. Orders were ignored. Commands were questioned. Fear was no longer working. The palace under pressure. Inside the presidential palace, the atmosphere had completely changed. The same place that once felt powerful and controlled now felt tense, silent, and unstable. Phones kept ringing. Messages kept arriving. Bad news, again and again. Another city has fallen. Another unit has surrendered. They are getting closer. Every report made the situation worse. But even now, Idi Amin refused to accept defeat. He continued to give speeches. He told the nation everything was under control. He told his remaining soldiers to stay strong. But deep inside, he knew the truth. The end had begun. The night of decision. Then came the night that changed everything. Amin sat alone for hours. No advisors. No officers. No guards close enough to hear him. Just silence. For the first time in years, he was not surrounded by power. He was surrounded by reality. And that reality was simple. If he stayed, he would be captured. Or worse. The secret plan. That night, a secret plan was made. No public announcement. No official order. Only a few trusted people were told. Amin was going to leave. Not as a leader. Not as a ruler. But as a man running away. The final hours in power. In the early hours before sunrise, the palace was unusually quiet. There were no loud movements. No dramatic scenes. Just quiet preparation. A car was ready. A small group of loyal guards stood nearby. No one spoke loudly. Because everyone understood. This was the end. The escape. Idi Amin left the palace without ceremony. No farewell. No speech. No final message to the nation. The man who once ruled millions with fear. Left in silence. He was taken to the airport. A plane was waiting. Within hours, he was gone. He left Uganda behind. Forever. The fall of power. When the people woke up that morning, everything had changed. The leader was gone. The government had collapsed. The fear, that had controlled the nation for years, was suddenly broken. People stepped outside carefully. Some didn't believe it at first. But slowly, the truth spread. He's gone. The end of an era. Tanzanian forces entered the capital. There was no strong resistance. No final battle. Very little was known about his daily life. He stayed away from the media. He avoided attention. He lived quietly with his family. Some said he had changed. Some said he had become a normal man. But no one truly knew the truth. The shadow of the past. Even in a peaceful place like Saudi Arabia, Amin could not escape his past. Because history does not disappear. It stays. It waits. And it reminds the world of what happened. The man who lost everything. In the end, Idi Amin had lost everything that once defined him. His country. His power. His control. All that remained, was his name. And the story attached to it. The quiet ending. Years passed. The world moved forward. New leaders came. New stories began. But Amin remained, a shadow of the past. A man who once ruled with fear. Now living quietly, far away from it. Years passed quietly. The man who once ruled with fear, was now living far away from everything he once controlled. In Saudi Arabia, Idi Amin spent his final years in silence. No power. No control. No crowds. Just time, and memories. A life in the shadows. Amin lived a quiet life. He stayed away from politics. He avoided public attention. Most of his days were simple. Praying. Spending time with family. Living like an ordinary man. For someone who once controlled a nation, this was a completely different world. The man who never changed. But one thing never changed. His mind. Even in his final years, Idi Amin never accepted that he had done anything wrong. He believed he had been a good leader. He believed he had protected his country. He never apologized. Not once. And that made his story even more complex. The health begins to fail. As the years passed, his health began to decline. Age was catching up. His body was no longer strong. The man who once looked powerful, was now weak. Slow. Tired. Eventually, he was admitted to a hospital. In 2003, his condition became serious. He was lying in a hospital bed. Surrounded by family. But far away from the country where his name was still remembered. There were no soldiers. No leaders. No power. Just a man, at the end of his life. The death. On August 16, 2003, Idi Amin died. Quietly. Without power. Without control. Without the fear that once surrounded him. His life had ended. But his story had not. The reaction of the world. When news of his death spread, reactions were mixed. Some people felt nothing. Some remembered the fear. Some remembered the pain. And some, simply moved on. Because for many, his story was not just about one man. It was about a time, they never wanted to remember again. The question that remained. Even after his death, one question remained. Was he a leader? Or was he a symbol of fear? Everyone had a different answer. But one thing was certain. His name would never be forgotten. When Idi Amin died in 2003, his life came to an end. But his story, did not. Because some stories don't end with death. They live on, in memories, in history, and in the lives of the people who experienced them. A country that had changed forever. Uganda was no longer the same country it had been before Amin's rule. Years of fear had left deep marks. Families had lost loved ones. Communities had been broken. Trust had been destroyed. Even after he was gone, the effects of his rule remained. The stories that survived. There were thousands of stories. Stories of people who disappeared. Stories of families who never found answers. Stories of fear, that stayed silent for years. Some of these stories were never told. Some were hidden. And some, were too painful to speak about. The survivors. There were also people who survived. People who lived through those years. People who saw everything. And their memories became part of history. They became witnesses. Witnesses to a time when fear ruled everything. The world remembers. Around the world, the name Idi Amin became a symbol. A symbol of power without control. A symbol of fear without limits. His story was studied, discussed, remembered. Not as inspiration, but as a warning. His story taught the world something important. Power without responsibility can destroy everything. Fear can control people for a time, but it cannot last forever. And no matter how strong someone becomes, their actions will always follow them. The silence that remains. Even today, in parts of Uganda, there are places where people still remember those years quietly. Not loudly. Not publicly. But inside, the memories are still there. Because some pain never fully disappears. The name that became history. Idi Amin is no longer alive. But his name remains. In books. In documentaries. In stories. And in the minds of those who lived through his rule. The story of Idi Amin is not just about a man who ruled with fear. It is a story about power, choices, and the human cost of cruelty. The rise and the fall. Amin rose from a soldier to a dictator. He commanded respect. He commanded fear. He ruled a nation with an iron fist. But the higher someone climbs with fear, the farther they fall. And when the fall comes, it leaves destruction behind. The lives forever changed. Millions of lives were affected. Families torn apart. Communities destroyed. Children grew up without parents. Friends vanished without explanation. And yet, the people survived. They rebuilt. They remembered. And they told the world the truth. The lessons of history. From Amin's story, the world learns a clear lesson. Unchecked power can destroy everything. Fear is temporary. Control over people lasts only as long as they remain silent. And cruelty will always leave a mark. The human cost. Idi Amin may have escaped justice in his lifetime. He may have lived in exile. But history remembers differently. The pain, fear, and destruction he caused are immortal. Because history does not forget. The story of Amin forces us to reflect. How fragile is peace? How valuable is freedom? And how much responsibility comes with power? Because in the end, it is not the fear a leader commands, but the legacy they leave behind. That defines them.